The desert wind of Tunisia whipped across the faces of thousands of exhausted men, their uniforms tattered and stained with the dust of a collapsing front. It was May 1943, and the legendary Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had finally surrendered. For these German soldiers, the war was over, but a new, bewildering chapter was about to begin. They stood in long, snaking lines, hands raised or resting on their heads, expecting the harsh brutality that usually follows defeat. They had heard the propaganda stories of what awaited them in captivity: starvation, torture, a slow death in a desolate wasteland. But as they looked toward the horizon, they were not marching into oblivion. They were about to embark on one of the most surreal journeys of the Second World War, a voyage that would take them from the scorching sands of North Africa to the heartland of their enemy. They were heading to the United States of America, a land that would confuse, awe, and fundamentally change them. As we delve deeper into this incredible story of the German POW experience in America, take a moment to subscribe so you won't miss what unfolds next. The sheer scale of the surrender in North Africa took the Allies by surprise. Over 250,000 Axis troops were taken prisoner in Tunisia alone. The British, already straining under the weight of war and rationing, simply did not have the resources, the food, or the space to house such a massive influx of men. The solution lay across the Atlantic Ocean. The United States was sending massive convoys of Liberty ships packed with tanks, trucks, and supplies to the European theater. These ships, once unloaded, were returning to American ports largely empty. It was a logistical masterstroke: fill the empty hulls of the returning Liberty ships with German prisoners. For the average German soldier, the prospect of crossing the Atlantic was terrifying. Most had never seen the ocean before the war, and now they were being herded into the holds of enemy vessels. The conditions on these transport ships were cramped and stifling. Men were packed into bunks, stacked 5 or 6 high, the air thick with the smell of sweat, diesel fuel, and seasickness. But the greatest fear was not the discomfort. It was the ocean itself. The Atlantic was a hunting ground for German U-boats. The prisoners knew better than anyone the efficiency of their own submarine wolf packs. There was a grim irony that hung over the convoy: the possibility of being torpedoed and drowned by their own comrades. Tension was high. Every creak of the hull, every alarm bell sent waves of panic through the prisoners below deck. They were helpless, trapped in steel cages, floating on a dark abyss. However, the journey also provided the first cracks in the wall of propaganda the soldiers had lived behind. As the days turned into weeks, the prisoners began to notice things that did not align with what they had been told. They were not being starved. In fact, the rations provided on the ships, while basic, were sufficient. The American guards, while often stern and aloof, rarely displayed the sadism the Germans had been warned to expect. There was a strange, business-like efficiency to the Americans that was disarming. They were not the monsters of Goebbels's radio broadcasts. They were simply men doing a job, often chewing gum and looking as bored as the prisoners themselves. When the ships finally approached the American coast, usually docking in ports like Boston, New York, or Norfolk, the prisoners were allowed on deck. What they saw stunned them into silence. In Europe, cities were blacked out at night to hide from bombers. Here, the American coast was ablaze with light. Cars moved along highways with their headlights on. Buildings glowed against the night sky. It was a psychological hammer blow. The German soldiers had been told that the Luftwaffe had reduced American cities to rubble, that the U.S. was crumbling under the pressure of the war. Yet here was a country that seemed completely untouched. The lights of New York City, or the bustling docks of Hampton Roads, projected an image of immense, unassailable power. One German prisoner later recalled standing on the deck as his ship entered New York Harbor. He saw the Statue of Liberty and the towering skyline of Manhattan, fully illuminated. He turned to his comrade and whispered, "We have lost the war." It wasn't a realization born of a battlefield defeat, but of a simple visual fact. A nation that could afford to leave its lights on was a nation that did not fear the enemy. After disembarking, the process of processing the prisoners began immediately. They were deloused, showered, and issued identification numbers. Then came the trains. If the lights of the cities were the first shock, the train journey across the American continent was the second. The United States needed to house these men far away from the coast and potential escape routes, so the camps were largely located in the rural South and the Midwest. The prisoners were loaded onto passenger trains, not cattle cars, but decent Pullman coaches with cushioned seats. This, too, was confusing. Why treat the enemy with such comfort? As the trains rolled westward, the sheer size of the United States became apparent. They traveled for days, watching the landscape shift from the dense forests of the east to the endless plains of the Midwest, or the cotton fields of the deep South. For men coming from the relatively compact geography of Europe, the scale was incomprehensible. They passed through town after town, seeing prosperous farms, factories belching smoke, and highways filled with civilian traffic. They saw no bomb craters. They saw no ruins. They saw a land of abundance. The train ride also brought the German soldiers face to face with the complexities of American society. Many of the porters and attendants on the trains were African Americans. For the German soldiers, indoctrinated with racial theories of Aryan superiority, this was a moment of intense curiosity and confusion. They watched how the white American guards interacted with the black porters, observing the segregation and the social dynamics of a country they only knew from caricatures. Conversely, the American civilians who gathered at train stations to watch the prisoners pass were often surprised by what they saw. They expected to see monsters, horns, and all. Instead, they saw young, often blonde, fit men who looked startlingly like their own sons and brothers. In some towns, the curiosity was so great that locals would run alongside the slow-moving trains, just to get a look at the Nazis. The destination for these trains was one of the hundreds of POW camps springing up across the country. By the end of the war, there would be over 600 camps in the United States, housing nearly 400,000 German prisoners. The camps were standardized, built quickly but efficiently by the Army Corps of Engineers. They followed a grid pattern, with barracks, mess halls, administration buildings, and recreation areas, all surrounded by double barbed wire fences and watchtowers. When the prisoners arrived at their designated camps, places like Camp Aliceville in Alabama, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, or Camp Concordia in Kansas, they prepared themselves for the hardship of prison life. They formed up in ranks, waiting for the camp commandant to scream orders or for the guards to beat them into submission. Instead, They were often greeted with a dull administrative speech about rules and regulations, followed by a meal. And it is the meal that stands out in almost every memoir and diary written by a German POW in America. The food was the third and perhaps most devastating shock. In the German army, rations had been dwindling for years. Real coffee was a memory. Meat was scarce. Bread was often filled with fillers. In the American camps, the prisoners marched into the mess halls to find platters piled high. There was white bread, soft, pure wheat bread that seemed like cake to the Germans. There was meat, huge portions of beef and pork. There were vegetables, potatoes, eggs, milk, and real coffee with sugar. The United States government had made a conscious decision to strictly adhere to the Geneva Convention of 1929. The convention stipulated that prisoners of war must be fed the same quality and quantity of food as the soldiers of the capturing army. Since the American GI was the best-fed soldier in history, the German POWs suddenly found themselves eating better than the civilians back home in Germany, and certainly better than they had on the front lines. The abundance was so overwhelming that it initially caused suspicion. Some prisoners refused to eat the corn, believing it to be swine fodder because, in Europe, corn was fed to pigs, not people. The white bread was so soft they thought it was undercooked. But once they began to eat, the realization set in again. The resources of the enemy were limitless. They were eating the surplus of a nation that could fight a global war on two fronts and still have enough food to fatten up its prisoners. The Americans didn't just have enough guns, they had enough butter. The psychological impact of this treatment was profound. It was known as the Golden Cage. The physical constraints were there, the fences, the guards, the routine, but the conditions were startlingly humane. This created a complex emotional state for the prisoners. On one hand, there was immense relief. They were safe, they were warm, and their bellies were full. They were alive while their comrades in Russia were freezing to death. On the other hand, there was a deep, gnawing guilt. How could they enjoy this comfort while their families in Hamburg, Berlin, and Dresden were being bombed night after night? How could they eat steak and ice cream while Germany starved? The camps themselves were organized like small towns. The barracks were simple wooden structures, usually heated by coal stoves. The prisoners were given standard U.S. Army cots and bedding. They were issued clothing, often surplus American uniforms with the letters PW, stenciled in large white letters on the back and pant legs. This branding was the only real visual reminder of their status, aside from the fences. Hygiene was strictly enforced. The Americans were obsessed with cleanliness to prevent disease outbreaks in the camps. Showers were mandatory, and the facilities were, to the surprise of the Germans, modern and functional with hot running water. For men who had spent months in the desert sand or the mud of the front lines, a hot shower was a luxury beyond measure. However, it is crucial to understand that the camps were not monolithic. The population within them was a microcosm of the German military. There were the ardent Nazis, the die-hard believers in Hitler who saw their capture as a temporary setback. There were the professional soldiers, the career officers who viewed the war through the lens of duty and discipline, but were not necessarily political zealots. And then there were the draftees, the ordinary men who had been pulled from farms and factories, who were simply relieved the shooting had stopped. In the early stages of the program, the Americans made a significant error in judgment. Lacking enough German-speaking guards or intelligence officers, they allowed the prisoners to organize themselves internally with little interference. The Americans generally adhered to the military hierarchy, meaning that German officers and non-commissioned officers, NCOs, retained their authority over the enlisted men within the camp. This seemed logical for maintaining order, but it had a dark side. It allowed the hardline Nazis to take control of the internal life of the camps. In these early days, behind the barbed wire of the Golden Cage, a shadow war began. The Nazi officers established a reign of terror to ensure that discipline was maintained and that no one wavered in their loyalty to the Führer. They set up kangaroo courts to punish those who spoke against the regime or who seemed too friendly with the Americans. The Gestapo of the camps monitored conversations in the barracks. If a prisoner expressed relief that the Allies were winning, or if he criticized Hitler, he could wake up to a beating, or worse. This internal struggle was largely invisible to the American guards in the beginning, who were just happy that the camps were clean and the prisoners were lining up for roll call on time. Despite the internal tension, the daily routine in the early months was defined by boredom. The Geneva Convention stated that officers could not be forced to work, and NCOs could only be assigned supervisory roles. Only the enlisted men could be compelled to labor, and even then, the rules were strict regarding safety and hours. In the beginning, the administrative machinery to put thousands of men to work hadn't been fully established. So, there were thousands of young, fit men sitting in barracks in the middle of nowhere, fed on high-calorie diets, with absolutely nothing to do. This idleness bred restlessness. The prisoners began to find ways to occupy their time. They organized sports leagues, playing soccer on the dusty fields of the camps. They started choirs and theater groups. They began to landscape the campgrounds, planting flowers and building intricate gardens around the barracks, turning the drab military installations into something resembling parks. The Americans watched with bemused fascination as the Germans built fountains and carved statues out of wood or stone found in the camp. One of the most significant aspects of the arrival was the interaction with the American guards. The guards were often men who were unfit for frontline duty, older men, or those with minor physical disabilities. They were not the elite combat troops. A strange dynamic often developed. The German prisoners, disciplined and fit, sometimes looked down on the sloppy appearance of the American guards, yet they envied their freedom. Over time, curiosity bridged the gap. Prisoners would trade handmade crafts, ships in bottles, wood carvings, paintings, for cigarettes or chocolate. But the reality of the war was never far away. Letters from home were the lifeline, but they were also the source of greatest pain. The Red Cross facilitated the mail, but it took months. When a letter arrived, the barracks would go silent. Men would read news of their destroyed homes, of brothers killed on the Eastern Front, of the tightening noose around Germany. The contrast between the peaceful, well-fed existence in a camp in Mississippi and the fiery apocalypse of Europe created a psychological dissonance that haunted every prisoner. The American public, too, had to adjust to the presence of the enemy in their backyard. Initially, there was fear. People in rural communities terrified that Nazi supermen would break out and slaughter them in their beds. But as the months went by and the escapes were few and usually non-violent, the fear turned to curiosity and, in some cases, resentment. Why were these enemies getting butter and sugar when American housewives were rationing every ounce? Rumors spread that the POWs were being treated too well. This political pressure would eventually force the government to adjust its policies. But in the beginning, the adherence to the Geneva Convention was absolute. The logic behind this strict adherence was not just humanitarian, it was strategic. The United States held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, but Germany held tens of thousands of American prisoners. The U.S. government believed, hoped, that if they treated the Germans well, the news would filter back to Berlin, and the Germans would feel compelled to treat American POWs with similar decency. It was a gamble on reciprocity. While the treatment of Americans in German camps was never as good as the treatment of Germans in American camps, it was undoubtedly better than the horrific treatment of Soviet prisoners by the Nazis. The Golden Cage was, in part, an insurance policy for American boys stuck in Stalag Luft camps across the ocean. As 1943 turned into 1944, the sheer number of prisoners continued to swell. After the invasion of Normandy, the trickle became a flood. Ships were arriving constantly. The system was straining. The boredom of the prisoners was becoming a security risk and a waste of potential resources. The United States was facing a critical labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas fighting. The farms were short of hands, the canneries were understaffed, and the timber industry was struggling. There sat an army of hundreds of thousands of healthy men, doing nothing but playing soccer and eating government beef. The solution was obvious, but it required navigating the complex rules of international law and the volatile internal politics of the camps. The transition from idle prisoners to a massive workforce was about to begin. This shift would bring the German soldiers out of the camps and into the fields and factories of America. It would bring them into direct contact with American civilians, farmers, shopkeepers, and families. It would shatter stereotypes on both sides and create human connections that would last long after the war ended. But before that could happen, the Americans had to solve the problem of the Nazi terror inside the wire. They had to figure out how to separate the die-hard fascists from the regular soldiers, how to utilize this labor force without violating the Geneva Convention, and how to manage the public relations nightmare of having the enemy harvesting the nation's crops. The arrival and the establishment of the camps was just the prologue. The true complexity of the POW experience, the work, the re-education, the forbidden romances, and the struggle for the soul of the German soldier, was yet to come. The golden cage was built, the door was locked, but the life inside was only just beginning to stir. To understand how this massive workforce transformed the American rural economy and how the U.S. military fought a battle for the minds of these men, we must look at the daily grind that followed the initial shock of arrival. The days of idle boredom were numbered. The whistle was about to blow, calling the Wehrmacht to work for Uncle Sam. Under the blazing sun of the Mississippi Delta, a strange scene unfolded in the autumn of 1944. In fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, men were bent over, dragging heavy sacks behind them, their hands moving rhythmically among the bolls of white cotton. At first glance, they looked like any other work crew, but if you looked closer, you would see the large white letters PW stenciled on the backs of their denim shirts and on the legs of their trousers. And if you listened, you would not hear the drawl of the American South, but the sharp, guttural sounds of the German language. These were soldiers of the Third Reich, men who had sworn allegiance to Adolf Hitler, now harvesting the crops that would feed the armies fighting to destroy him. It was one of the supreme ironies of the war. The American home front was being saved from economic collapse by the very men who had tried to dismantle it. As we continue this exploration into the hidden history of World War II, please make sure you are subscribed. This story challenges everything we think we know about the enemy, and there is much more to uncover. To understand how the Wehrmacht ended up in the cotton fields and canneries of America, we must look at the desperate situation the United States faced in 1943. The arsenal of democracy was churning out tanks and planes at a record pace, but the human cost of the war was draining the workforce. Millions of able-bodied American men were overseas. The draft had hollowed out rural communities. Farms sat untended, and crops were rotting in the fields because there were simply no hands to harvest them. The War Manpower Commission was facing a crisis. The food supply, essential not just for the U.S. but for Britain and the Soviet Union, was in jeopardy. The solution sat idle in the hundreds of camps scattered across the country. There were hundreds of thousands of fit, disciplined young men doing nothing but eating government rations. The logic was undeniable, but the legalities were complex. The Geneva Convention of 1929 allowed for prisoners of war to be worked, but with strict caveats. They could not be forced to work in war industries. They could not manufacture shells or build tanks that would kill their comrades. The work had to be safe, and they had to be paid. The American government launched a massive labor program that would eventually see German POWs contributing millions of man-hours to the U.S. economy. But moving these men from the camps to the fields was not as simple as opening the gates. Contracts had to be signed. Farmers and business owners had to apply to the government for POW labor, proving that they could not find American workers to do the job. The government would pay the prisoners' wages to the War Department, which would then pay the prisoners a fraction of that amount. For the German soldiers, the call to work was met with mixed emotions. For the die-hard Nazis, working for the enemy was treason. They argued that every bushel of wheat harvested by a German soldier freed up an American man to go to the front and shoot at Germans. They organized strikes and sit-ins, refusing to leave the barracks. But for the vast majority of the prisoners, work was a salvation. The boredom of the camps was a psychological torture. Idleness bred depression and infighting. The prospect of leaving the barbed wire, even for a day of hard labor, was appealing. It offered a change of scenery, a sense of purpose, and, crucially, money. The pay was standardized at 80 cents a day. This might sound negligible, but in the economy of the prison camp, 80 cents was a fortune. It was paid not in U.S. currency, which could be used to aid an escape, but in canteen coupons or scrip. This internal currency could be used at the Camp Post Exchange, the PX. With 80 cents, a prisoner could buy packs of cigarettes, bottles of beer, chocolate, soap, toothpaste, and even stationery to write home. A man who worked 6 days a week lived like a king compared to those who refused to work. The economic incentive quickly overpowered the ideological resistance for most soldiers. The agricultural program was the largest sector. Across the Midwest, the South, and the Southwest, German POWs became a fixture of the landscape. They harvested sugar beets in Nebraska, picked peanuts in Georgia, and threshed wheat in Kansas. The clash of cultures in these fields was profound. American farmers, often wary and hostile initially, expected the Germans to be lazy or saboteurs. They were shocked to find that the Germans worked with a ferocious intensity. The cultural work ethic of the German soldier, combined with military discipline, made them incredibly efficient laborers. There are countless anecdotes of this strange collaboration. In many cases, the guards, bored and confident that the prisoners wouldn't run, would fall asleep under a tree, leaving the German NCOs to direct the work. Farmers, seeing the men sweating in the sun, would often ignore the strict non-fraternization rules. At lunchtime, instead of the prisoners eating their cold rations apart, farmers would invite them to the farmhouse porch. They would share iced tea, sandwiches, and cigarettes. In these moments, the war seemed very far away. A farmer in Texas might struggle to communicate with a mechanic from Bavaria about the engine of a tractor, using hand signals and broken words, bonding over the universal language of mechanics and agriculture. However, it wasn't always a pastoral idyll. The work was backbreaking. In the timber camps of the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest, German prisoners were tasked with logging, dangerous, exhausting work that required skill and strength. Accidents happened. Men were crushed by falling trees or maimed by machinery. In the canneries, the heat and the noise were relentless, but the prisoners took a grim pride in their output. Some work detachments even set records, competing against other POW crews to see who could harvest the most tons of beets in a day. Yet, while the prisoners were integrating into the American economy by day, a dark and violent struggle was consuming the camps by night. This is the aspect of the POW experience that is often overlooked. The internal war for control between the Nazis and the anti-Nazis. As mentioned in Part 1, the Americans had allowed the German military hierarchy to remain intact. This meant that Nazi officers and NCOs retained control over the enlisted men. The Lager Gestapo, or Camp Gestapo, was a very real and terrifying presence. These hardcore loyalists were determined to maintain the purity of National Socialism even behind barbed wire. They viewed any cooperation with the Americans as betrayal. They monitored the mail, listened to conversations in the mess halls, and kept blacklists of traitors. The atmosphere in some camps was thick with paranoia. A prisoner who spoke too loudly about the hopelessness of the war, or who seemed too friendly with an American guard, might find a note on his bunk. These notes were often signed by the Holy Ghost, or simply marked with a swastika. They were warnings, stop or else. If the warnings were ignored, the violence followed. This culminated in the Fimi murders, a reference to medieval German secret courts. These were kangaroo courts held in the dead of night in the back of a darkened barracks. The accused would be dragged from his bed, tried for treason by a panel of Nazi officers, and sentenced. The execution was usually carried out immediately and made to look like a suicide. The victim would be found the next morning hanging in the latrine or beaten to death in a way that suggested a brawl. One of the most infamous cases occurred at Camp Concordia in Kansas. A captain named Franz Kotha was suspected of passing information to the American intelligence officers. The camp leadership decided he had to die. He was cornered and forced to write a suicide note before being hanged. The American authorities were initially naive. They accepted the suicide verdicts at face value, not wanting to disrupt the order of the camps. It took time for American intelligence to realize that they were harboring a miniature Third Reich within their own borders. The violence was not just physical, it was psychological. The Nazi leadership in the camps controlled the flow of information. They would read the American newspapers provided to the camps and dismiss them as Jewish propaganda. They organized education sessions that were nothing more than indoctrination classes, singing Nazi songs and celebrating Hitler's birthday with elaborate ceremonies right under the noses of the American guards. In some camps, the swastika flag was secretly sewn together from scraps of cloth and displayed during these midnight rallies. The American government eventually realized the magnitude of the problem. They began a program of segregation, attempting to separate the ardent Nazis from the rest of the population. They established special high-security camps for the super-Nazis, such as Camp Alva in Oklahoma. Alva was known as the Alcatraz of the POW system. It was where the diehards, the SS men, and the murderers were sent. But for a long time, the average German soldier in a regular camp lived in fear not of the Americans, but of his own bunkmates. Despite the shadow of the Theme courts and the hard labor, life in the camps developed a complex social structure and a vibrant culture. The prisoners had money, they had time, and they had among them some of the most skilled craftsmen and intellectuals of their generation. The camps became small cities with their own economies and entertainment. The University of the Barbed Wire was a phenomenon seen in almost every major camp. Among the prisoners were professors, teachers, engineers, and musicians. To combat the boredom, they organized classes. A soldier could finish his high school education, learn a new language, study engineering, or take art classes, all taught by his fellow prisoners. The American authorities, including the YMCA and international relief organizations, encouraged this. They provided books, instruments, and classroom materials. In some camps, the libraries were better stocked than those in the surrounding American towns. Music was a central part of camp life. The Germans formed orchestras, jazz bands, despite the Nazi ban on jazz, which they happily ignored in America, and massive choirs. They put on theater productions, building elaborate sets and sewing costumes from whatever material they could scavenge or buy. They performed everything from Goethe and Shakespeare to variety shows. American officers and even civilians from nearby towns would often attend these performances, marveling at the professionalism of the enemy. Craftsmanship was another outlet. Using wood from crate scraps, stones from the fields, and metal from tin cans, the prisoners created works of art. They built ships inside bottles, carved intricate chess sets, and painted landscapes of the American countryside. The canteen system allowed them to buy paints and tools. Many of these items were given as gifts to guards or farmers, and today they can still be found in attics and museums across the United States. Tangible relics of a strange friendship. The canteen, or PX, was the heart of the camp's social life. It was where the 80 cents a day was spent. The prisoners could buy 3.2% beer, a low-alcohol brew that was standard in the army. In the evenings, the canteen would resemble a German beer hall. Clouds of cigarette smoke would fill the air, the sound of accordion music would play, and men would drink their beer, temporarily forgetting the barbed wire outside. They could buy Coca-Cola, a drink many had never tasted before and which became wildly popular. They bought heaps of chocolate and American toiletries. The abundance of the canteen was a constant reminder of the material wealth of their captors. Religion also played a role. While the Nazis tried to suppress religious observance, many soldiers found solace in faith. Chapels were built by the prisoners, often with stunningly beautiful altars carved by hand. American chaplains, often Lutheran or Catholic priests who spoke German, ministered to the men. For some, the church was a refuge from the Nazi ideology that permeated the barracks. For others, it was simply a link to the traditions of home. As 1944 drew to a close, the dynamic of the war began to shift dramatically. And with it, the atmosphere in the camps. The news from Europe was becoming impossible to ignore or dismiss as propaganda. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Soviets were pushing from the east. The letters from home became more desperate. Stories of cities leveled by firebombing, of refugees fleeing, of a total collapse. The denial that the Nazi leaders had enforced began to crack. The American government also shifted its policy. They realized that simply warehousing these men was a missed opportunity. They launched the Intellectual Diversion Program, a secret plan to re-educate the German prisoners. The goal was to denazify them, to teach them the values of democracy, so that when they eventually returned to Germany, they would be the architects of a new, peaceful nation. This was a controversial and difficult undertaking. How do you undo a decade of indoctrination? They started by subtly changing the media available in the camps. They introduced newspapers and films that showed the reality of the concentration camps and the atrocities committed by the Third Reich. Initially, the prisoners reacted with disbelief and anger, calling it fake. But as the evidence mounted, and as the war in Europe reached its undeniable conclusion, a crisis of conscience began to sweep through the camps. The Golden Cage was no longer just a place of physical confinement. It was becoming a crucible for the German soul. The interactions with Americans played a huge role in this shift. It was hard to maintain the belief that Americans were soulless, racially inferior degenerates when the farmer you worked for shared his lunch with you, or when the nurse at the camp hospital treated your injury with care. The personal diplomacy of the cornfields and the factory floors was doing more to denazify the soldiers than any lecture could. However, the end of the war was approaching, and with it came a new anxiety. What would happen to them? Would they be sent back to a destroyed Germany? Would they be handed over to the Soviets? The comfort of the American camps, once a source of guilt, now became a source of security. No one wanted to leave the land of plenty to return to a land of ruin. The story of the German POWs is not just one of captivity. It is a story of transformation. From the fanatical Nazi enforcers executing their own in the dark, to the young boys learning about democracy while picking cotton, the camps were a microcosm of the struggle for the future of Germany. In the final part of this series, we will witness the collapse of the Third Reich from the perspective of the prisoners. We will see the shocking moment they were forced to watch footage of the Holocaust, their eventual release, and the bittersweet return home. We will also explore the legacy of the thousands who eventually returned to the United States, not as soldiers, but as immigrants seeking the American dream they had first glimpsed through a barbed wire fence. The most emotional and transformative part of their journey lies ahead. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the conclusion of this epic saga. The spring of 1945 arrived in the United States with the scent of blooming dogwoods and the promise of warmth. But inside the barbed wire of the German POW camps, the air was thick with a suffocating dread. The news from Europe was no longer just a trickle of bad omens. It was a deluge of catastrophe. The map of the Third Reich, which had once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga, was shrinking by the hour. In the mess halls, where prisoners gathered around radios and pinned maps to the walls, the mood shifted from defiance to a grim, silent resignation. They watched the red arrows of the Soviet army closing in on Berlin, and the blue arrows of the Americans and British sweeping across the Rhine. For the men in the golden cage, the physical comfort of their American captivity was becoming a torment. They were safe, well-fed, and healthy, while their wives, mothers, and children were huddled in cellars as their cities burned to the ground. The psychological dissonance was breaking them. As we approach the powerful conclusion of this saga, witnessing the transformation of enemies into immigrants, please take a moment to subscribe. You won't want to miss the final chapter of this extraordinary history. The first major crack in the prisoner's worldview came in April 1945, but not from a battlefield defeat. It came with the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the camps, the die-hard Nazis rejoiced. They believed, fueled by the propaganda of Goebbels, that Roosevelt was the primary architect of the war against Germany, and that his death would lead to the collapse of the American war effort or a civil war. They celebrated openly, singing songs and toasting with their canteen beer. But their celebration was cut short by the reaction of the American guards and the American public. Instead of collapsing into chaos, the nation mourned. The vice president was sworn in, and the war machine continued without a momentary stutter. The smooth transition of power in a democracy was a shock to men raised on the Führer principle, where the state was embodied by a single man. It was a practical lesson in the resilience of the system they were fighting against. Then came the final blow. On May 1st, the radio announced the death of Adolf Hitler. For the prisoners, this was the end of the world as they knew it. The reaction in the camps was a complex mixture of shock, denial, and, for many, a secret, overwhelming relief. The Nazis within the camps, who had terrorized their fellow prisoners for years, suddenly fell silent. The spell was broken. In the days following the announcement, camp commandants reported a strange phenomenon. The latrines were clogged with swastika badges, medals, and Nazi flags. Men were frantically destroying the symbols of their allegiance, flushing them away in the night. The fear of the Femi courts evaporated. The gods of their ideology were dead, and they were left alone in the middle of America. But the American government was not done with them. With the military victory secured, the battle for the mind began in earnest. The Allies had liberated the concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The images captured by Signal Corps photographers were too horrific to be believed, and the American authorities knew they had to show them to the prisoners. General Eisenhower issued the order. The German population, including the POWs in America, must see what was done in their name. This led to one of the most intense and harrowing experiences of the entire POW program. The prisoners were marched into the camp theaters or mess halls. The windows were blacked out. The doors were guarded. They expected a Hollywood movie or a newsreel. Instead, the projectors whirred to life, and the raw, unedited footage of the Holocaust filled the screens. They saw the piles of skeletal bodies bulldozed into mass graves. They saw the gas chambers, the ovens, and the hollow stares of the survivors. The reaction in the darkness of those halls was visceral. Reports from the time describe scenes of absolute breakdown. Men vomited on the floor. Others wept uncontrollably, burying their faces in their hands. Some fainted. There were those who screamed in denial, shouting that it was a trick, a Hollywood fabrication, a wax museum exhibit created by the Jews. But for the vast majority, the sheer scale of the horror made denial impossible. These were soldiers. They knew what death looked like, and they knew what rotting flesh looked like. This was no special effect. When the lights came up, the silence was deafening. The arrogance of the Afrika Korps, the pride of the Wehrmacht, lay in tatters on the floor of an American mess hall. Many prisoners were so ashamed they burned their uniforms. They ripped the German insignias off their sleeves. A deep, collective depression settled over the camps. The golden cage had become a hall of mirrors, forcing them to look at the monster they had served. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "We have been led by criminals. We are the pariahs of the world. I wish I had died in Tunisia." It was in this fertile ground of disillusionment that the American intellectual diversion program finally took root. The goal was to re-educate the prisoners, to turn them into ambassadors of democracy who would rebuild a peaceful Germany. The Americans identified the anti-Nazis and the intellectuals among the prisoners, and gave them resources. They launched a newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call, written and edited entirely by German POWs. It became a forum for debate, for literature, and for a brutally honest examination of the German catastrophe. They published articles analyzing the failure of the Weimar Republic, the rise of Hitler, and the future of Europe. It was the first free German press in over a decade, operating out of a prison camp in Rhode Island. Classes on American history and civics were held. But the most effective re-education was not in the classroom. It was still in the fields and the farmhouses. As the war ended, the fraternization rules were relaxed. The relationships between the prisoners and the American families became even closer. Farmers, realizing that these boys would soon be leaving, often invited them to Sunday dinner. They gave them clothes. They exchanged addresses. The demonization of the enemy had completely dissolved into a human connection. The prisoners saw that a democracy could be strong, prosperous, and generous. They saw a society that, for all its flaws, did not require a secret police to function. However, as 1945 turned to 1946, a new frustration arose. The war was over. The surrender was signed. The prisoners expected to be put on ships and sent home immediately. They packed their meager belongings. They saved their canteen coupons. But the ships did not come for them. The reason was a brutal calculation of geopolitics and economics. Europe was destroyed. France and Britain were bankrupt, and their infrastructure was in ruins. They needed labor to rebuild. The United States, under pressure from its allies, agreed to transfer hundreds of thousands of German POWs not to Germany, but to France and Britain to be used as labor reparations. When the news broke in the American camps, it was met with fury and despair. The prisoners felt betrayed. They had worked hard for the Americans. They had followed the rules. They had believed in the fairness of the U.S. government. Now they were being sold like cattle to the French. The transfer began in early 1946. The journey back across the Atlantic was a grim mirror image of their arrival. They left the land of abundance and sailed back to a continent of starvation. For many, the stopover in France was the worst period of their captivity. The French, understandably bitter after years of brutal occupation, treated the German prisoners with harshness. The food was scarce, sometimes nearing starvation levels. They were forced to clear minefields, a violation of the Geneva Convention, and many were killed or maimed. The contrast between the steak and eggs of the American camps and the watery cabbage soup of the French camps was a physical shock that killed many who had grown soft in the golden cage. It wasn't until 1947 and 48 that the majority of these men finally crossed the border into Germany. The homecoming was not the joyous reunion they had fantasized about for years. They arrived in a landscape they did not recognize. The cities of their youth, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Cologne, were moonscapes of rubble and twisted steel. The Stunde Null, or 0 hour, was a time of absolute misery. The physical condition of the returning prisoners created an immediate and painful barrier between them and their families. The men coming from America, despite the hardships of the French transfer, were often still healthier and better fed than the German civilians who had survived the turnip winter and the bombings. A returning soldier might greet his wife, who was gray, emaciated, and aged 10 years by the war, while he looked relatively fit. He had spent the war playing soccer and eating chocolate in Mississippi, while she had been burying neighbors and boiling wallpaper for glue to eat. This guilt of the survivor haunted many marriages. The returning men were strangers, ghosts from a time of plenty entering a world of want. They also faced the denazification tribunals run by the Allies. They had to prove they weren't war criminals to get work cards or ration stamps. But for those who had been in the American camps, they had a secret weapon. They spoke English. They understood the American occupiers. They knew how to play baseball and how to joke with the GIs who were now patrolling their streets. This cultural fluency made the former POWs the perfect intermediaries. They became the translators, the drivers, and the local administrators for the American military government. They became the architects of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that would rebuild West Germany. But the story didn't end there. The connection to America had been forged in steel. Throughout the late 40s and early 50s, a massive stream of mail flowed between the U.S. and Germany. American farmers sent care packages to the men who had once harvested their corn. Boxes of coffee, sugar, flour, and cigarettes arrived in starving German villages, sent by families in Texas, Kansas, and Alabama. These packages saved lives. It was a phenomenon unique in history, the victors feeding the vanquished, not out of government policy, but out of personal friendship. Then the return migration began. The German soldiers had seen the vastness of America, the freedom, and the opportunity. They looked around at the ruins of Europe and remembered the lights of New York and the fields of the Midwest. Thousands of former POWs applied to immigrate to the United States. In many cases, they were sponsored by the very farmers they had worked for as prisoners. Imagine the scene. A man stands on a dock in New York in 1952. He is not wearing a field gray uniform with PW on the back. He is wearing a cheap suit. He is not a prisoner. He is an immigrant. He takes a train to a small town in Nebraska. He walks up the lane to a farm. The farmer comes out, not with a shotgun, but with a handshake and a hug. The former enemy becomes the neighbor, the son-in-law, the citizen. These men integrated seamlessly into American society. They became mechanics, engineers, bakers, and professors. They rarely spoke about the war or their time in the camps to their American neighbors who didn't know their history. They were the quiet Germans. But every year, on certain dates, they would gather in small groups, in beer halls in Chicago or Milwaukee, to reminisce about the strange days when they were the guests of Uncle Sam. The legacy of the German POW program in America is a testament to the power of human contact. It proved that ideology is fragile when faced with the reality of a shared meal and shared labor. The U.S. government's adherence to the Geneva Convention, the decision to treat the enemy with dignity, paid dividends that lasted for generations. It turned hundreds of thousands of potential insurgents into allies. It planted the seeds of the strong post-war alliance between the U.S. and Germany. Today, the camps are mostly gone. The wooden barracks were torn down or sold for scrap decades ago. The barbed wire has rusted away. In places like Aliceville, Alabama, or Hearne, Texas, only concrete foundations remain in the tall grass. But in local museums, you can still find the wood carvings, the paintings, and the letters. And in the cemeteries near these old camps, there are rows of simple headstones with German names. The men who didn't make it home, who died of appendicitis or accidents, buried in the soil of the enemy they had crossed an ocean to fight. The story of the German POWs in America is a reminder that even in the midst of the greatest conflict in human history, the line between enemy and friend is thinner than we think. It is a story of how a golden cage became a bridge between two worlds. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through one of the most fascinating and overlooked chapters of World War II. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please hit the like button and share this video. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you can be part of our next exploration into the past. There are millions of stories waiting to be told, and we are just getting started.